Okay, on behalf of the Gateway Green Alliance and the Universal African Peoples Organization, want to welcome everyone to our webinar focusing on solidarity with Cuba. We want to thank everybody that's present, and I just want to remind people that there will be 4 major speakers who will have 7 to 10 minutes to make a presentation. And afterwards, we would also have solidarity statements from several progressive organizations. And the solidarity statements at some point will be emailed to everyone. On that note, our major speakers will include Alison Bodine, and she is an organizer with Friends of Cuba Against the United States Blockade and the Fire This Time movement for social justice in Vancouver, Canada. Also, we will have Don Fitz. He's on the editorial board of Green Social Thought, an online publication, and was the 2016 Missouri Green Party candidate for governor. Also, we have Gail Walker. She is the executive director of the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization, which organizes the annual Friendship Caravans to Cuba to challenge the U.S. government's brutal blockade of the island. This organization also facilitates the application process and mentors young people from the United States who are studying medicine at Cuba's Latin American School of Medicine. Last but not least, we have Alan Bernstein. Alan is a counseling psychologist. After many years with IFCO, she most recently directs the Parents Association that offers support to U.S. Elam graduates. On that note, we will begin with our very first presenter, and that would be Alison Bodine, Friends of Cuba Against the U.S. Blockade.
Thank you very much, Zaki. Hello from Vancouver, Canada, to everyone from around the United States, and especially from the Missouri Green Party. It is really an honor to be invited to speak today. I thank very much Dawn and Chris and the others who thought to invite me from all the way up here in Vancouver, Canada. I think really the discussion that has been organized today is an example of what we need to be doing in these difficult times of COVID-19 and the pandemic, connecting internationally in our struggles for a better and more just world. And that is exactly what I think we can learn from Cuba, and I hope to discuss tonight. But what I'm bringing to the discussion today is more context about the cruel US blockade on Cuba. From here in Vancouver, Canada, I organize with an organization called Friends of Cuba Against the US Blockade. And typically we would be having a protest in front of the US consulate every month here in Vancouver with other groups across Canada and around the world. But because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're getting the opportunity to reach out to more people, organize more coordinated events, and really talk again about the nature of this cruel and illegal blockade. The blockade is now 6 decades old, nearly. It's measures imposed by the United States government, a series of sanctions imposed on Cuba that many people have probably heard of, but don't understand exactly how they work, or may have been told, for example, that Cuba has access to medicine or humanitarian goods, which is not true. It is an outright lie. And so we see, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, the cruelty of the US blockade being further exposed. And it is our responsibility to really help to educate people about this and let them know what Cuba is facing at the hands of the US Trump administration. A full trade blockade was imposed on Cuba in 1962. And since its inception, this unjust and cruel US policy, which Cuba refers to as genocidal, has hurt all sectors of Cuban society, cutting access to medicines, school supplies, travel, international trade, construction materials, and the list goes on. The US blockade on Cuba has put an enormous strain on Cuba's economy, causing Cuba to lose approximately $4.5 billion in the year 2019 alone, nearly $1 trillion, adjusted for inflation during 60 years of the blockade. And the blockade also impacts and hurts people living in the United States through imposing travel restrictions or international legal financial penalties on US companies, blocking the sale of Cuban medicines to the United States, and more. And just talking about medicines, this is an example that how this lack of cooperation has had a deadly impact in the United States during the COVID-19 crisis. Following the historical reestablishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba on December 17, 2014, and the subsequent relaxing of some measures of the US blockade and travel ban, the Trump administration has rolled back all of even these modest gains made in negotiations between President Raul Castro and President Obama, and has in fact increased the US blockade on Cuba. Between January 2019 and March 2020 alone, the US has imposed 90 additional measures within the US blockade on Cuba, illegal and unilateral measures specifically designed to punish an entire country for not following the orders of the United States government and being independent of US foreign policy. In May 2019, so just 1 year ago, the US government tightened the 57-year-old blockade on Cuba by invoking Title III of the Helms-Burton Law, which allows the US to further punish non-US entities that trade with Cuba. Then in June, the US Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets and Control restricted non-family travel to Cuba by removing the people-to-people educational travel license category. It's meant to stop many people from the US from visiting Cuba in an educational capacity for sports or artistic or cultural exchanges. Today, commercial and charter flights to Cuba are restricted to flying in and out of Havana alone, which is meant to target Cuba's tourism industry. Now, under the COVID-19 pandemic, the cruelty of the US blockade on Cuba is further exposed. This includes the blocking of humanitarian aid shipments to Cuba, which is consisted of medical supplies needed to combat the pandemic. They've continued to enforce and expand the measure of the US blockade that prevents Cuba from buying anything that has more than 10% of its components manufactured in the United States, which has directly prevented Cuba from buying 2 life-saving ventilators. There's also the case of a ship that has arrived at a Cuban port this week, and it had raw materials Cuba needed to produce medicines, but the bank transfer never went through and the ship never unloaded in Cuba. In addition, sanctions on Venezuela, another independent country, have further limited Cuba's access to fuels, which they've been receiving in exchange for sending doctors and medical professionals to Venezuela, which we'll hear more about in the future speakers. This has put added pressure on Cuban society and the ability of their free and universal healthcare system to rapidly respond to COVID-19. Now, part of today, we're going to be talking about that healthcare system, but I wanted to emphasize that we must think about what would be possible for Cuba's healthcare and for Cuba if they weren't under this crippling blockade. How many lives have been lost due to this cruel US policy? And what is our responsibility? To that, I will say we need to do more of what we're organizing here today. We need to recognize that blockades and sanctions are weapons of war and get involved, whether it's in our local community or in internationally organized groups. I encourage people to find out more as we listen to this webinar. And before we go into discussion, I'll be back again to give you all some more specific ways that we can build a stronger and a more united Cuba solidarity movement. Thank you.
We want to thank you for your great presentation, Allison. At this time, we will now hear from Don Fitz, Missouri Green Party.
Okay, Nathan, could you put the slide up? We want to go to slide 2, which is the San Pablo leper colony in Peru. In 1950, get the next slide. Okay, in 1951, a medical student left medical school to take an 8-month motorcycle trip throughout South America. He wanted to look at lepers, be with lepers. His name was Che Guevara. And that trip changed him totally. He developed a vision of a new medicine for the world. Okay, let's fast forward 70 years. Go to the next slide, 3. This is the slide that we're going to see here is a consultorio or doctor's office, which is the basic unit of the Cuban healthcare system. Notice that it's a plain office in what used to be a home. Okay, let's go to the next slide, 4. What you'll see is that the posters on the wall, when I visited that particular consultorio, were very homemade, very skimpy. Okay, let's look at the next slide. We'll see another poster on the wall, which has first-year student, fourth-year student, fifth-year student. These are the students who are linked to the blockade. Okay, linked to the healthcare system, linked to that particular consultorio. Let's look at the next slide, 6. This is taken just a month to 6 weeks ago. These are medical students who are distributing homeopathic medication to help prevent COVID-19. Now, these students are all linked to a doctor's office, a consultorio, and they are distributing homeopathic medication. Okay, let's go to slide 7, next slide, 7. This is a CDR office. The woman on the right is the head of the local CDR in that district, a Committee for Defense of the Revolution. And this is not really part of the medical system. It's for defending Cuba from attack. But during hurricanes, the CDR is very important in evacuating elderly, sick, disabled, mentally ill people, and it helps in a lot of medical crises. Let's go to the next slide, which is slide 8. That we're at. This is when we visited a clinic in Cuba. This is a nurse who took us around to visit the clinic. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I just want you to see that was on the door. It was a Saturday, so we couldn't go in. But natural medicine is a critical part of Cuban medicine. Let's go to the next slide, 10. We see somebody getting acupuncture. These are taught as part of Cuba's medical school classes. You don't have natural medicine and then regular medicine. Medical students learn all of it. Okay, what the clinics are doing now in the time of COVID-19 is they have regular meetings with the consultorio doctors. In other words, all the doctors' offices are linked to a clinic, and the clinics share information from the national headquarters, and they also get information that the doctors from the clinics are sharing with them. Okay, let's go to slide 11, which is Salvador Allende Hospital. If you've been to Cuba and are aware of the medical system, the chances are very good you've seen Salvador Allende. Okay, and it's one of the best known hospitals. Let's go to the next slide, which is of a patient's room. Now, you notice how I was saying how the consultorio is very plain. You notice how this hospital room is very plain. You notice the air conditioning system, an open window. You don't see the TV set with 500 plus channels. I would guess these are students from Alam who are learning about medicine at the hospital. Okay, okay, keep on this slide for a second. Salvador Allende changes its practices for medical staff during the time of COVID-19. Now, doctors and nurses and other staff go in for a 15-day shift, and they stay at the hospital in an isolated portion for the 15 days while they're working with patients. Then they go off of that 15 days to another 15 days where they're in isolation or in a ward with other people, but not going home, staying at the hospital. Then they go home for 15 days, and they are basically quarantined at home. So it's 45 days where they do not have contact with other Cubans. And so what this does is prevent doctors and other medical staff from going back into the community if they get infected by COVID-19. Okay, let's look at the next slide. This is Cuba has a lot of maternity. Has a lot of different types of hospitals and medical facilities. This is a ward. This is a house for women who are at risk pregnancies, and they stay there. Okay, let's go to the next slide. If you've visited the medical system in Cuba, you've seen the Pedro Curie Institute of Tropical Medicine. This is one of the best known facilities in Cuba, which has received international attention. Okay, during the dengue outbreak of 1981, they developed interferon alpha 2B, which is now being used to treat COVID-19. Let's go to the next slide. At the same time that United States, which is like a month or two ago, people were complaining all over the country for not having personal protective equipment. At the same time, this photo came from Cuba of somebody working at Pedro Curie and fully protected. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is a couple who were in the middle of the COVID-19 who work at Pedro Curie, and they got married. And the left side is them not at work, and the right side is them fully protected when they are at work. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Cuba has a fully integrated medical system. This is a meeting of the Cuban Ministry of Public Health. The initials are MINSAP, M-I-N-S-A-P, and that's how it's referred to. Cuba had its first death from AIDS in 1986. They got, the MINSAP got together, coordinated their work with every other section of the medical system that I've talked about, and Cuba had a total of 200 HIV cases. At the same time, New York City had 43,000. And Cuba and New York City are about the same size. Okay, let's go to the next slide. The MINSAP communicates with Cubans every day about how many cases there are. And basically Cuba, there's no concept that every province has their own policy, every city has their own policy, and people argue about when to do what. You know, the information flows from the base, from the citizens to the citizens to the consultorio, to the polyclinic, to MINSAP. And so there's a unified national policy. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And this is about international medicine. This is from 2010. If you remember, Haiti had an earthquake, and Joanna left medical school at that time, took a break, and she went to work in Haiti. Okay, next slide. And then this is the Peruvian consulate. This is Cuban doctors at a Peruvian consulate, which is rare because Cubans usually just do work in other countries. But let's go to the next slide. This is of a medical student giving an exam to a person at a festival that I went to in Lima, Peru. By 2008, Cuban doctors had treated 70 million people in 154 countries. And so that's, you know, and now it's, you know, we're 12 years later, so it's many, many more. Let's go to the next slide. And with COVID-19, the last I read, Cuba had gone to over 20 countries. This is St. Lucia, and there's photos of, I just saw one today of Cuban doctors going to South Africa, which is an economically advanced country. Let's go to the next slide, 23. This is Cuba, Cuban doctors going to Lombardy region in Italy. Italy was having a difficult time getting support from other European nations. And this is a very unique photograph because it shows a poor country. Remember all the things I showed about how primitive in some ways the consultorio is and the hospitals are, not having all sorts of luxuries that the US does, but yet Cuba can afford to go to a European country when other European countries can't. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Cuba has been bringing people to Cuba since the 1960s to study. In Chernobyl, they brought 25,000 people who had been damaged by radiation. This is a photograph of a student studying in 2006 at Alam, which I'm not going to say any more about because you're going to hear plenty about Alam very soon. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And I don't know if you've heard of this, but that's Te Quiero Cuba. I love Cuba. The background of this is that there was a British cruise ship, MS Braemar, who had 50 crew members or passengers with COVID-19. And even though it was British and the Bahamas and Barbados are part of the British Commonwealth of Nations, they did not allow it to dock there. And the only country in the Caribbean who allowed it to dock was Cuba. And that's, you see the crew saying, you know, I love Cuba. Okay, so in saying this, my main messages are two. The two things I wanted to come across is that Cuba did not just do the things that you hear about today out of the blue. They come out of over half a century of modifying and changing and improving the medical care system. And the second point I want to make is that Cuba has corporate medicine in the US has an overproduction of frills. And it has an overproduction of frills, but an underproduction of medical staff. Cuba is the opposite. It has an overproduction of medical staff so that people can move into crisis situations very quickly, can go around the world, but Cuba has an underproduction of frills and unnecessary things. And the last slide is dear to my own heart. And that's a book I'm coming out with next month. And so, which you've heard about a 2-hour presentation in 10 minutes, and I hope you were able to absorb some of it, but I go into a great detail of the book. And if you have any questions after everybody else has spoken, give me a question. I'll do the best I can to answer anything about Cuba's history, Cuba's medical history.
Okay, on that note, we want to thank Don for such a great presentation, especially the slide presentation. Now we'll move on to Gail Walker with the Interreligious Foundation of Community Organizations.
Great, thank you so much, Zaki. Thank you to the Missouri Green Party for hosting this important conversation on solidarity with Cuba, especially in the age of coronavirus. In fact, as previous speakers have highlighted, during this pandemic is an important time to be talking about ending the US government's genocidal blockade and supporting Cuba's gift of medical cooperation. Since the triumph of the revolution in 1959, Cuba has embraced international collaboration, and perhaps this has been manifested best through its commitment to medical internationalism. And the purest expression of that medical internationalism here in the United States has been Cuba's generous medical school scholarship program at the Latin America School of Medicine, also known as ELAM by its Spanish acronym. But for nearly 30 years, IFCO, the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization, has engaged in Cuba solidarity initiatives, including annual caravans, delegations, informational webinars. And this long-standing relationship with the island nation led our Cuban friends to entrust Cuba with the responsibility to recruit and recommend candidates for full scholarship to attend Cuba's Latin America School of Medicine, or ELAM. 20 years ago, when my father, IFCO's founding director, the late Reverend Lucius Walker, stepped forward to offer IFCO's services to facilitate this program, we had no way of knowing how this project would change the lives of ELAM students and graduates, the communities they serve, and how it would revolutionize healthcare in the United States. And thanks to the vision of Comandante Fidel Castro, who took a naval barracks and converted it into an internationally renowned medical training facility, tens of thousands of young people from more than 125 nations, including the United States, are now practicing medicine in underserved communities across the globe. It was quite a visionary project, one that really got its start, as the brainchild of Fidel, who I think I would assume took that saying, if you give a person a fish, they eat for a day, but if you teach them to fish, they eat for a lifetime. Cuba was providing healthcare to countries across the globe, as Don just laid out. There have been a number of examples of Cuba's, international solidarity. But I think the idea was to take it a step further and to provide opportunities for young people to go to ELAM, train, study, become doctors, and then return home and serve in their own communities. And it's been a beautiful, beautiful, wonderful gift to the world that Cuba has given. To date, ELAM has graduated nearly 200 doctors from the United States, the very country that has imposed a genocidal blockade against it for more than 6 decades. It has been IFCO's distinct honor to serve as the sole facilitator of that scholarship program since the year 2000. And that's just one example of how Cuba's medical internationalism is at play in the United States. We also know that Cuba has successfully manufactured medical treatments that the world can benefit from, including those in need here in the US. Perhaps the most well-known Cuban innovation is the vaccine Simivax, invented by researchers at the Center of Molecular Immunology in Havana. Simivax targets a growth factor in cancer cells in a way that can arrest the spread of the disease. It can be used by both as treatment for lung cancer patients and preventative measures for people at high risk of disease. Another treatment that Cuba has manufactured since 2006 is a drug for foot ulcers called Herbiprot P that prevents the need for amputations by accelerating the skin's healing process, closing a wound safely over the course of 3 months. And today, Cuba has taken on coronavirus. Cuba is successfully administering this human recombinant interferon alpha 2B for COVID-19 patients. Don was just referencing it. This is a project called, there is a project rather called Saving Lives that is calling for Cuban doctors to be allowed to come to the United States to share their expertise in the fight against COVID-19. More than 200 medical professionals, academics, and elected officials have endorsed a statement calling for medical collaboration with Cuba, incorporating Cuba's interferon alpha 2B in clinical trials and ending the attempts to stop other countries from accepting Cuban medical assistance, as well as measures preventing Cuba from importing medical equipment and medicines. These are all references to the blockade that Allison mentioned early on. In this moment, when the planet is facing a pandemic and the lives of hundreds, there's just people, human beings are at risk, solidarity and collaboration, we feel, are essential. And we believe that no source of life-saving expertise can be sidelined in this fight against this new disease. Another important tool that Cuba is putting to use to confront the pandemic is contact tracing, referred to in Cuba as pescasaje. This is the process of identifying people who may have come into contact with an infected person, the process of going door to door to communicate with residents who have, it's been used in Cuba for other outbreaks of medical outbreaks such as dengue fever. Medical students, including those from Elam, visit neighborhoods and question residents about how many of them are living in the house, whether there are anyone in the house with symptoms, etc. And this information is provided to the family doctor who's responsible for that neighborhood. This process is a way to identify and contain the virus, critically important for a small island nation working to combat death and disease. Now, Don just laid out really the levels of healthcare in Cuba, but I just want to say, Cuba's healthcare system is far better suited to providing care at its multiple levels than we are here in the U.S. As many of us know, in the U.S. and poor and working class communities, often the first point of health care is the emergency room, which is woefully inadequate. And in Cuba, because of those multiple layers that Don so eloquently laid out, the family doctor, the neighborhood clinics or consultorios, the hospitals, the medical institutes, there are various levels on which disease can be tracked and cared for, and Cuba's system is more adequately set up to address that kind of thing. And very importantly, Cuba's approach offers the population a sense of comfort and confidence, unlike in the US, where there is rampant fear and a lack of information. And unless, of course, you are including advice from the occupant of the White House to ingest disinfectants like bleach or to insert ultraviolet light in the body, there really is not a lot of comforting information out there. Cuba's history of medical internationalism is having an impact, and indeed, the seeds that Cuba has planted are bearing fruit. And we've seen Elam grads accomplish great feats during their Cuban training, from working in various settings across the United States and in other countries, including Haiti, following the earthquake, and Liberia to help out during the Ebola outbreak, and other examples. And more recently, in this fight against COVID-19, we've learned how Elam students and grads are on the front lines in Cuba and here in the United States. And that's thanks to what Cuba has provided us. So as we work here in the US to revolutionize healthcare, It is certainly a blessing to have Cuban-trained doctors working in some of the most underserved communities across the country. And that commitment on the part of the graduates is being put to the test at a time when we need it most, and that's during this horrific coronavirus pandemic. So in closing, I just say, the world may be quarantined, but solidarity is not. And that's why we continue to work to educate people in the US about the impact of the US government's longstanding sanctions against Cuba, to end all restrictions on travel to Cuba, and to call for a regime change in the US and not in Cuba.
On that note, we want to thank you, Ms. Gail Walker, for your great presentation. And at this time, we are moving forward with Ms. Alan Bernstein, who is representing the U.S. ELAM organization.
Thank you, Zaki. Am I tuned in now? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, fine. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you, Don, for inviting me to participate. Thank you to the Missouri Greens for organizing this important event. And thanks to all of the previous speakers for being very comprehensive and very eloquent in sharing so much information. It's hard to come after all of that, but I really appreciate what's been shared. And as I've been preparing for this, I've been thinking, some of the thoughts I've had have sort of organized around the theme of reflections on things we're not allowed to know, which has to do in part with the information blockade that comes with how healthcare is done in Cuba. In my many years of working in solidarity with Cuba, organizing with the Pastors for Peace caravans, working with the med school program, congressional delegations to Cuba, one of my favorite parts of the work has been the way that it holds up a mirror to how we live in the United States. And we get to see some of the particular things that are so counterproductive, so corrosive, so dangerous, so ass backward, if you pardon the expression. But we just take for granted that that's how our lives need to be because that's how we live here. And I'm talking about things like gun violence, I'm talking about student loans, but here today especially, we're talking about just about everything in the United States that has to do with healthcare. I'm sitting here in my home, which is pretty much in the epicenter of this pandemic, just a little bit from the George Washington Bridge. And the town next to me is the town that had New Jersey's first hot zone. We've already had 1,400 deaths in this county. And tomorrow starts the 3rd month of quarantine. And in that time, I've been thinking a lot about one of the stories that Don mentioned, which has to do with how Cuba dealt with its first case of AIDS and how it handled the AIDS crisis. There was a gentleman who was a Cuban dancer who had come back from Angola. And after a certain period of time, he started to manifest the full-blown symptoms of AIDS with all of the dangers of that. Now, Cuba, this is in the late 80s. Cuba is a poor, small, island blockaded nation without economic resources. The Soviet Union, which was the main trading partner and ally, was starting the perestroika era, so everybody knew that the special period and all the deprivations of that were coming soon. And this is before the triple cocktail is invented. So AZT is the only treatment, but AZT is not available in Cuba because it's made in the United States and it's blockaded. So what the Cubans did have was a public health structure that worked. And they also had this very passionate determination to contain the virus. So they set their biotech institutes to work on producing and mass manufacturing the old ELISA tests that were the first tests for AIDS. And it's worth saying that it wasn't 15 or 20 different corporations competing against each other to try to see who could get to market first. And you didn't have a lot of tests on the market that were unreliable like we're seeing now in the US. What you had was all the best minds in the country who knew the science came together, worked collaboratively to produce the tests. And then the Cubans did universal mandatory testing all across the island. So they got their results in the early days before the crisis had blown up too big. And what they found was 800 or 900 people across the island who were HIV positive. And they responded to that by setting up a series of sanatoriums throughout the island where the people who were HIV positive were to come and spend a minimum of 8 weeks, but they were isolated. They were quarantined. Now, the Cubans didn't have a lot of treatments for them. They didn't have the AZT, but they gave them high protein diets, and not having to wait online for food in that epoch was a good stress reduction technique. They used lots of natural and traditional medicines, and they used lots and lots of health education. The idea being that once the critical time had passed and they were confident with any particular patient, that they were savvy enough about safe sex techniques that they weren't going to spread the virus across the island. As soon as they had that confidence in the level of education, the folk were free to go home. Now, how that got reported in the United States was that Fidel Castro was isolating all of the homosexuals in concentration camps. And there was a big uproar in the United States about civil liberties being abnegated in Cuba. There was a big fuss in Miami and a lot of other places. But the part that we didn't get to know until later was that Cuba, because of that forethought, because of that proactive public health move, because what they did was to test, contact trace, isolate, and then educate and treat where they could. If that sounds familiar to you, it's what we're all praying for now. But because they did that on the early end, Cuba has had the lowest frequency of HIV of any country in the hemisphere, and probably any in the world. I would guess that in the other hemisphere, there aren't too many that would surpass it. And it's important. There was a story on this issue that showed on 60 Minutes after all the hubbub about the crisis. And I remember there was a public health expert from the United States who was commenting on it. And he said, now it all depends on whether we view this as a public health crisis with civil liberties ramifications, or a civil liberties crisis with public health ramifications. And one of the things we know about Cuba is that in that case, they will lean toward public health. Now, that whole impetus reminded me also of a speech that Fidel made back in '98 when he was announcing the foundation of the Latin American School of Medicine as part of the comprehensive health plan for Central America and the Caribbean that Cuba announced as a response to Hurricanes Mitch and George. And in the speech, he gave an analysis of the health situation in the region. And he pointed out that at that time in history, the infant mortality rate in Nicaragua was 10 times as high as it was in Cuba. In Haiti, it was almost 20 times as high. And he said something that was so striking. He said, you know, really, it would be a pretty simple thing to save those babies' lives. What you need is medicines that are pretty inexpensive, because you're talking about very standard problems of health. You need the medicines, you need the personnel to discussion about the pandemic. Very soon after that, you hear the words authoritarian state or police state, or only communist China would isolate people. And in our society now, we have people demonstrating against the restrictions because they say their civil liberties are being infringed. But there's something deeply ironic about that to me, because this whole idea that we've been told that free market democracies, as it were, are not supposed to quarantine people means that now we all have to be quarantined. And we still don't have any idea who's sick or how to measure the disease or how to move ourselves through it. And of course, it's even harder to share a lot of these stories these days because of the profound polarization in our society. Look what happened to Bernie Sanders when he mentioned the literacy campaign. So then it feels like public health, these wonderful models of public health and health internationalism and basic stuff about how to survive a viral outbreak, all of that gets filed into the category of things we're not allowed to know. And again, it comes back to the fact that in that dialectic between the public good and the individual good, the Cubans are going to lean toward public health. And what we see from that over the years is that that gives people confidence in their government. because they understand that their government is looking out for their best interests, even when the resources are really scarce. And so often when the resources are scarce, they know that it's because of the limitations of the blockade. Nobody thinks that Cuba would want to run with the scarcities they do if they had access to those resources. And then by contrast, the current US administration seems to be broadcasting every day that its biggest priority is to jack up the stock market and to restore the economy, even if it kills us or kills a number of us. It may just be that our culture of individualism and narcissism and racism and neoliberalism and all of this is somehow fundamentally antithetical to concepts of public health. And I can tell you from where I'm sitting here in New Jersey in May of 2020 that I kind of like the idea of living in a country where the government cares about keeping me and the people I love alive. That thing about the political will to want to do it keeps coming back to me, that Cuba, even with no money, even with so little in the way of economic resources, even with 60+ years of the punishing blockade, with no surplus of anything except for human resources and talent and ingenuity and heart and solidarity and a spirit of giving and an understanding of the bigger world. With all of that, they've been able to accomplish all of the things that Gail listed, all of the things that Don talked about. They take care of their own people. They're all over the world. They've sent doctors now. They've trained doctors who are working in emergency rooms and ICUs in New York City. And they're working in community clinics in union halls in New York, in the Central Valley, working with migrant workers in California. And it's such a beautiful gift. There are thousands of stories to tell, but I know time is tight and I have 2 short ones that I want to share before I end. I was remembering when we traveled to Cuba with Curtis Muhammad, who was a lead organizer in the Lower Nine after Hurricane Katrina. And we took him to meet the founding rector of the Latin American School of Medicine. Excuse me. Let me just take a sip, sorry. We took Curtis to meet the rector of the Latin American School of Medicine, Dr. Juan Carrizo Esteves. And the Latin American School of Medicine was the site where they were training people for the Henry Reeve Brigade that was supposed to come to New Orleans, except for President George W. Bush never acknowledging the invitation or the offer. And Dr. Carrizo, with so much emotion, sat with Curtis and talked about how intense the training was and how much the people wanted to come. And that was so striking to me, that there was so much feeling in it. It wasn't a banner then anymore. It was Dr. Carrizo saying to Curtis, we had our bags packed. We trained for weeks and months. We were hoping we could come to help you. You had the sense that they really understood that people were suffering and struggling so much in New Orleans, and they wanted to be able to help. And then Curtis responded with tears in his eyes. And by then we all had tears in our eyes. And Curtis said, one of the greatest injustices that has been done to my people, he said, meaning people of African descent living in the United States. One of the biggest injustices is that we have been forbidden from knowing that we have international friends. And yes?
And on that note, we,
okay.
In terms of the time, I've just informed the time is, if you can just shorten your point. Okay,
well that's the end of that piece. I was going to tell a little story about Fidel, and I can do it quick if I have a minute. May I?
Go ahead.
We were blessed to have an opportunity to visit with him in 2009. It was 6 months into Obama's term, and Fidel was recovering from surgery. But he looked great. He was a little frail, but he looked great. He showed us he was reading Obama's autobiography, Dreams from My Father, and he was underlining sections, and he spoke with us about his impressions of Obama. And he was very thoughtful. He said, well, it comes from an interesting international background. He's very intelligent and he seems to be empathic. He's a scholar of constitutional law. Government. It says I'm muted. Are you still hearing me?
Yes.
Good, thank you. But he also is a community organizer, so he's worked in and outside the system. And then he paused for a second. And I remember I kind of braced myself. I thought, now he's going to lay into us about the blockade. And he looked at us all and he's, in a very quiet voice, he said, I really hope Obama can figure out how to do healthcare. So I just wanted to share that with you, because in addition to everything we do to defend Cuba, to end the blockade, to support the graduates of the program who are embodying Cuban medicine here in the United States now. In addition to all of that, we want to heed Fidel's admonition and make sure to keep reaching people with this information. They're not supposed to know that it is okay to be healthy in this society, and that God willing, we can build that better world that we all know is possible. Thank you so much. And thanks for the extra minute.
Okay, then we want to thank you, Alan Bernstein, for your great presentation. And let me say, as moderator, we have had some great information this evening. I'm sure those who are listening in will agree with all of the presentations. On that note, as we move forward in the program, at this time, we will be hearing brief solidarity statements of no more than 2 minutes. And the very first solidarity statement with the work of Cuba and its COVID-19 efforts is from the organization I represent, the Universal African Peoples Organization. First and foremost, I just want to say, in terms of solidarity statement, my solidarity statement is in solidarity with all that has been presented this evening. But also let me just add a couple of things just came to my mind in terms of presentation. We have to push as a collective the premise that the United States is committing crimes against humanity as it relates to its blockade against Cuba and denying it material resources to further their great work in terms of health for our people. Also, I'm just struck by most recently the call from certain Republicans in regards to China saying that there ought to be reparations. How dare they in terms of the need for reparations for Black people here in this country, as well as if we talk about reparations, Cuba needs to have reparations for the many years of blockade that has impacted its people and are not allowed the people to prosper and be a great force for world peace. Last but not least, just want to remind, and has been brought out before, that Cuba offered support for the United States after the 9/11 incident, as well as Hurricane Katrina, which was just mentioned by Alan. So at this point in time, our organization, in support of some other organizations that have circulated a letter calling for the United States Congress, the White House, and the U.S. Senate to grant Cuban medical personnel permission to deploy an emergency brigade to immediately come to the United States borders to provide hands-on medical assistance in hospitals, clinics, and other emergency installations. And finally, that the same White House, U.S. Congress, and U.S. Senate grant the American Medical Association, the National Medical Association, the Black Nurses Association, permission to supervise the Cuban medical personnel efforts on U.S. soil to assist in the fight to eradicate the COVID-19. And we're proud that Cuba was able to offer services to Italy, as well as even a French parliamentarian had asked for assistance in France. So that speaks well of Cuba. On that note, we'll move to our next solidarity statement, and that should come from Howie Hawkins, all the way in from New York, the Green Party of New York. Howie.
Thank you. You know, we need the blockade to end as much as Cuba does, because the two governing parties in this country are presiding over a failed state when we look at the response to this COVID-19 crisis. I mean, Trump's not just incompetent. He only cares about himself. He doesn't care about us. Now he's sending people back out to die for the Dow without personal protective equipment, without a test, trace, and quarantine program, no OSHA standards, and Biden is invisible. So what I take away from this discussion is we need to learn from the Cuban model. You know, our best proposal right now is what they call Medicare for All, National Health Insurance Program, where the single public payer would pay for medical services, but the delivery would still be private. So we get the kind of problem like in the neighborhood I'm in right now. There are no doctors, there are no clinics. This is a poor, mostly African-American neighborhood. 2 miles to the community health center where they get Medicaid, or up on the hill to the hospitals by the university. And half the people in this community don't have cars. So obviously the health outcomes in this neighborhood are much worse than people that can afford. And the private deliverers compete with each other. So they got too many MRIs up at those hospitals competing for customers, and we don't have doctors down here in the neighborhood. So I think what we gotta revive is the National Health Service model. Back in the 70s, you had the Nixon option, which is what became Obamacare. You had National Health Insurance, Kennedy bill, which is what we call Medicare for all. And then there was Ron Dellins, who had a National Health Service bill, community-controlled National Health Service, where the hospitals and clinics are publicly owned. The doctors and nurses are on salaries, so they can focus on care instead of running people too fast and give them extra tests and treatments to make money for their, hospital or their clinic. And the community would have an elected board they elect people to, so they could get a system that responds to them. And that's one thing I take away. We need to get rid of the blockade so we can learn what Cuba's been doing and show people here how it's a better model. The other thing is this medical internationalism. There's a young Black woman from this neighborhood. She's not so young now. She went to that Latin American School of Medicine in Havana, Cuba, from this neighborhood. And she's the only person that we know of from the neighborhood that got a medical education. And so the United States, instead of being the world's military empire, should be the world's humanitarian superpower, and learn from Cuba how to use our wealth to provide medical help to people around the world and make friends instead of enemies. So I think there's a lot we can learn from Cuba's medical system, and damn, we need it here because, we got 4% of the world's population and a third of the people that have died from this pandemic because we're living in a failed state. So end the blockade.
Thank you. End the blockade. I must agree with you. At this time, we will be hearing from Margaret Flowers with Popular Resistance. And just before she comes on, I just want for everybody, the participants, and we have at least 31 participants, we will have a question and answer period after the final solidarity statement. At this time, Margaret Flowers, Popular Resistance.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate you inviting me to participate in this important event tonight, and I really appreciate the comments of everyone. Popular Resistance is an organization that works on a broad range of issues, and personally, I'm a pediatrician by training. One of the issues that's been near and dear to me is healthcare and fighting for a healthcare system in the United States that provides care to everyone, not access to care, but actual care to everyone. I had the privilege a few years ago to work with the International Committee for Peace, Justice, and Dignity, who brought a delegation from Cuba of health professionals to our area, and we helped to organize events for them at many of the hospitals and universities. And I was so impressed by what I learned from these health professionals. And one of the things that I didn't hear mentioned, but I think is really critical, that they've also, I don't know, somebody's typing, if they can mute, maybe that's you, Howie. One of the things they mentioned that they have developed a treatment for diabetes that has reduced the number of amputations by over 70%. And I'm sure people know in the United States that that's a huge problem here with people who can't even afford to get treatment or much less have access to the diet that they need. So, this kind of collaboration is so critical, and we are suffering because we don't have that type of collaboration. And I just want to quickly mention kind of the moment that we are historically. The United States is losing power in the world, and this pandemic has really, I think, accelerated that by showing the world that we are not a leader, not someone that they should follow, and we're moving towards a multipolar world. We're seeing so many efforts at collaboration, countries calling for a global ceasefire, calling for international solidarity and collaboration, calling for making sure that every person, no matter where they are in the world, can get the treatment that they need to stop this pandemic. And so I think that this type of collaboration that we have with people around the world to show them that not everyone in the United States is okay with the US doing what it's doing, which is, ratcheting up economic warfare, military aggression. I think it's important for us to continue to push in the United States for this cooperation and for putting a people-centered human rights and peace and environmental protection at the forefront of what happens here. So I think this work with Cuba is so important, and I appreciate everyone on the call that is doing this work, and we are strongly in solidarity with you, and we'll do whatever we can to support. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Margaret. At this time, we will now hear from Tom Ablin, Veterans for Peace.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Zachy. And thanks to everybody on the panel. I could have listened to you for a lot longer. That was really great. I appreciate that. And I'm sure everybody else enjoyed it. So I just wanted to say that as chapter president for Veterans for Peace, we are basically the spearhead of U.S. foreign policy, and there's vast experience within the military establishment from current members and ex-members of what our foreign policy looks like around the world. Cuba is a classic example, and I really liked what Zaki said about the reparations to Cuba. If just reparations to Cuba, what we use their military base for, Guantanamo, I'm talking about, it would equal a lot of money. We have roughly, nobody knows for sure, but it's around 850 military bases around the world. Well, everybody on here is smart enough to know there's not even 850 countries in the world. So what does that tell you? So I wanted to bring up something here that was kind of interesting. Just to give you a little background on Guantanamo. We opened that base, and you could just say it was under duress, as many of our military bases are around the world. Cuba doesn't want us to be there. They didn't want us probably to be there then. But it opened in 1903, shortly after this Spanish-American War. And we paid the Cubans $2,000 in gold coin annually. In 1934, the United States unilaterally changed the payment from gold coin to US dollars per the Gold Reserve Act. The least amount was set at US $3,386.25, based on the price of gold at that time. In 1973, the US adjusted the lease amount to $3,676.50. So it went up about $300. And in 1974, it went up to $4,085 based on further increase to the price of gold in US dollars. So when you talk about reparations, we haven't even paid the Cubans a fair amount to have that base. And why did we have the base there in the first place? Well, originally it was used as a coaling station to resupply US Navy ships with coal. So, and not to mention the fact that we're only 90 miles off the coast of Cuba. There's really no reason for a US military base to be there. And, but I think we're there because we can be. They can't stop us. I mean, who are they gonna, they can't kick us out.
So Tom, yeah. I've been notified that time is, that 2 minutes is,
okay.
It runs real quick.
Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to say that we are we're in full support of Cuban sovereignty, and we're in solidarity with the Cubans. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tom. Moving forward, I have a statement from Glenn Ford from the Black Agenda Report. I will not read all of his statement because of the time constraints, but the theme of his statement is Cuba and the New Human. And just parts of it starts off, if socialism values all human lives equally, then the health of the people is the best measure of the progress of the revolution. And since the revolution must be global, then the duty of socialist countries, no matter their size and material capacity, must be to propagate and share their medical expertise with the peoples of the world, especially with those societies that have been most deeply wounded by imperialism. Cuba saw its medical and military internationalism is ideologically and morally inseparable from building socialism within its own borders. Just as the struggle against imperialism is international, so is the battle against disease and the capitalist-made conditions that render humans prey to biological pathogens. Cuba regards every triumph of socialist medicine as a shared victory for all humanity, which cannot be said for the capitalist business of healthcare. I think those speaks well of his thought patterns as his solidarity statement with the work of Cuba. Our last presenter will once again be Ms. Allison Bodine. She will remind us how to oppose the blockade.
Thank you. I have the honor of bringing us back before we go into question and answer, which I think will be a very fruitful discussion. I am left with definitely the impression of really having deeply explored the ways we need to examine the society we live in, whether the US or Canada, in relation to the question of really why does the United States have this criminal blockade against Cuba, and what can we do to fight against it in the context completely of the crisis in the US imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic and the criminal neglect of the United States government towards its people. For 6 decades, as I said, for anyone that hasn't joined, the US has had a policy against Cuba known as the blockade. It prevents Cuba from accessing vital medicines, industrial machinery, school supplies, construction supplies, medical equipment, computer technology, to the tune of about $12 million a day is what it costs the Cuban economy to have this policy imposed. And during a time of COVID-19, we can all imagine what this impact has been. At the same time, this policy has also attempted to cut people in the US off from the benefits of friendship and solidarity with the people of Cuba, as well as from life-saving Cuban medicines and scientific research. This criminal policy is a financial, economic, media, and information blockade. But it's also important we remind ourselves that the world has spoken out against the US blockade on Cuba. In November 2019, the United Nations voted for the 28th consecutive year in favor of a resolution demanding the US lift the blockade on Cuba. Once again, the vote was overwhelmingly against the blockade, with 187 countries voting in favor of the resolution and only 3 voting against: the US, Israel, and Brazil. So as with so many other important issues of justice and building a better world, the climate crisis, blockades and war and sanctions, the struggle for immigrants and refugees, I think the opportunities and the amount of poor, working, and oppressed people around the world that are with us in our struggle is growing. But we really have to work to unite around common actions to build this better world. So I think everyone's put forward a number of good suggestions, just to remind a few ways that we can all get more involved in solidarity with Cuba and against this criminal blockade. There's the Saving Lives campaign that Gail Walker mentioned, focusing on US, Cuba, Canada medical cooperation, savinglives.us-cubanormalization.org. I'll put the link in the chat. There's a petition organized by Code Pink Women for Peace to award the Nobel Peace Prize to the Henry Reeve International Medical Brigades from Cuba that are fighting COVID-19 around the world. I'll put that link in the chat as well. And there's many petitions, including one against the US blockade organized by Cuban Americans in Florida. So I encourage people to share these and to also think of the ways they can organize online events like this. A lot of us who spoke tonight would be very willing to speak to any sort of audience. And the more we can do to build Cuba solidarity at this important time, the more we can fight this criminal policy while at the same time fighting against its negative impacts on people in the United States.
Okay. All right, I want to thank you for that presentation. At this time, we will open it up for questions. I believe they need to be typed out. I'm not absolutely sure. Or, yes, I think they need to be typed out and directed to our panelists. Before we get into the questions, I just want to thank Nathan, who's kind of organizing this whole process of us being able to see each other. Thank you, Nathan. So on this note, the questions. Anybody have questions?
Teresa El Amin says on Southern Anti-Racism Network based in Columbia, Georgia. What is your question? Teresa, do you have a question to type in? I think the panelists also, if they want to, if any panelists have questions also, that would be fine as well.
All right. So is there any other typed in questions, Nathan?
Not yet. Here we go. Here we go. I've got one. From Digger Romano, I have seen sources that say 75% of Cubans have been tested for COVID-19. How did they get the equipment to do that? Question.
Any of our panelists want to respond to that question? Everybody don't have to speak at the same time.
You probably have to unmute yourself.
Now I'm unmuted.
I mean the panelists.
Oh, okay.
I can start and see if anyone else wants to add. So it's hard to answer a question that doesn't reference exactly what the source is. But I think it's important just to once again talk about Cuba's method of screening people, which it's possible this referred to. It could refer to the process Cuba has of really checking on people door by door. They've been sending doctors, including doctors at the Latin American School of Medicine, to really document people experiencing symptoms, to contact trace people, and to determine if they have symptoms of COVID-19. I haven't seen anything saying 75% of them has been tested, but it's also very possible that they have developed an ability to test people given donations from countries like China. A lot of these donations have been refused, and for example, the Alibaba donations that China sent around the world were not able to be received in Cuba due to the US blockade. But I will say that if the statistic that you found, however, what was referring to, Cubans are very inventive and very careful in their medical system and the way that they would determine if people are testing positive or not. They have only, I think as of yesterday, about 1,800 cases in Cuba and less than 100 deaths. So whatever they are doing is definitely very positively impacting public health in Cuba, and they are definitely putting the interests of people before those of profits.
Let me just add in also, if I may, I just saw a Reuters article in the last day or two that talks about the increase in testing. And it doesn't give the specific numbers of how many people have been tested in Cuba, but it says that initially they were using expensive tests and they were developing other tests just as everybody else is. And they had some test kits that were donated from other places, but more recently they've learned to use a platform. We keep hearing the folk here talk about platforms for testing. They have a platform that they can ramp up for antibody testing. And so they were able to double the number of tests they did in just a couple of days using the technology they had already developed for testing other viruses. And that's as much as I know about that.
Okay, Nathan, next question.
The next thing, Barbara had a quick comment, I believe, if she wants to throw that in.
Okay, that was me typing in on Barbara's computer. Okay, one of the things I wanted to point out, well, first of all, let me get to the contact tracing. Digger was asking about how many people in Cuba have been tested. I know that Cuba, when it first started, they were able to do contact tracing of looking at everybody who had all the contacts of people. And so there was a area in Havana called Vedado, where a lot of people who are not tourists but live from foreigners live, and they shut off the dado for a period of time. And somebody had to show that they had been tested to get back in. And so there is an extensive amount of contact tracing in Cuba. Okay, the comment that I wanted to make has to do with Medicare for All. I think it's very important for us to realize that Medicare for All is a great way to start out in the United States. It's like a beginning point, not an end point, because the Cuban system goes far, far beyond Medicare for All. The doctors in Cuba are completely linked to the polyclinics. And in the United States, the doctor's office, you can be anywhere and have a doctor's office. I mean, there's no connection. In Cuba, the doctor's office is everybody in a neighborhood, about a 4 square block area, about roughly 1,500 people are dealt with by the doctor's office. So the doctor knows everybody and what their problems are. And then that goes into the clinic level, which is a much larger group of people, and that goes into the national system. So Cuba is able to contact everybody with medical questions. They can reach the entire nation. And this, in the United States, it's like you have a doctor's office. It can be any place. There might be a clinic, but that's not connected to the doctor's office, and the hospital really isn't. You just have privileges at the hospital. There's no real connection. One of the things I wanted to say is that when you look at the finances, Medicare for All would save a whole lot of money in the United States, but the Cuban system, they spend about 5% per person per year of what the US does. So they can have a much more extensive system for much, much cheaper. After the revolution, one of the first companies that was nationalized was the large pharmaceutical companies, which would be a great step in the United States to just nationalize all the pharmaceutical companies.
I saw a question from Christina Mann that asks, what is the status of travel to Cuba today? And the panelists like to respond.
This is Gail. I can just try to jump in. Just before I do that, I just wanted to say, you know, the couple other things to add on to what has already been mentioned is that there are daily reports that are in the midday news that about the what's happening, not only in terms of the number of cases, but also just information direct from you know, the source, the directors at MNSAT that are providing regular information. So Cubans are highly informed, not only in this particular case. I think in general, there's a sense of you know, knowledge about what's going on, and that's, you know, helpful, I think, about, you know, in terms of fighting any kind of a challenge, and certainly in this case of fighting this pandemic. So that's another piece of information I want to say. As far as travel goes, you know, there had been restrictions on, as most countries, and Cuba was probably the last one to do this, for airplane travel into the country, again, in an effort to try to, you know, really keep track of the virus, to make sure that they were caring for the people. And but I do know, or I do understand, that there are some limited planes that will be allowed to be making their way in, so that there's at least some opening up of some of those the travel. What kind of ability people have to leave from here is one thing, but the fact is that there would be some kind of quarantine in place when people arrive in Cuba. I believe it's a 14-day period. Was my last understanding of what folk needed to expect if they were to travel to Cuba. Again, you know, in an effort to contain the virus.
Okay, we want to thank Teresa L. Amin for signing the petition, and she made mention that there was a question above the petition. Can you see the question?
Yes, I can see it. Teresa L. Amin asked, how can we push for an end to blockade? How can we bring the light to the great debt we owe Cuba for her excellent healthcare generosity around the world, especially for the African peoples.
And also, I just want to thank her for her kind donation after signing the petition. So any of the panelists would like to respond.
I'll just quickly jump in and just say, certainly the Saving Lives campaign that Allison just referenced is one way for people to be informed. There's, a variety of different folk that are doing work, IFCO Pastors for Peace, the Venceremos Brigade, the various, the International Committee, too many to list here, but that are all, I think, involved and engaged in educating people about the blockade, the impact of it, and encouraging people to go, and encouraging them to reach out to their elected officials and to demand that they hear the voice of the vast majority of people in this country who are opposed to this long-standing draconian blockade policy. So those are just a couple things. I'm sure others have others that they can add.
Anybody else want to add in as far as response to help breaking blockade? Okay, seeing none, we'll accept 1 or 2 more questions. Anybody else?
Sorry, Zaki, I raised my hand like we were in a room.
Oh,
But we're not.
didn't see you.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
So while people think of some questions, I'll just say to beyond supporting organizations in your own cities or getting involved around the U.S.-Cuba normalization, which is running the Saving Lives campaign. It's basically a coalition of groups and individuals across the U.S. and Canada. There's also other work happening, including organizing of webinars that can be shared with friends and family. And the next one is actually May 19th. It's on next Tuesday. It's Malcolm X's birthday, and it's a celebration called Paying Humanity's Debt, Cuba, the Caribbean, and Africa. And so it's about the important relationship and international solidarity of Cuba towards the peoples of the Caribbean and Africa, and has a really excellent lineup of speakers. So I'll paste that chat as well, and just invite people to go to the website of the U.S.-Cuba normalization, and you can email to get involved and sign into meetings where there'll be other campaigns happening. And I think we also, there will be a point when we can gather in person again. And so let's also continue to brainstorm ideas and talk about building a consistent movement, a creative movement in solidarity with Cuba, one that can put pressure on politicians, but also just make sure people in the US know about Cuba. I know that there's more discussion now about Cuba maybe than there was when I was in high school in Colorado, but when I was in high school, there was still the compass on the map over the island of Cuba because no one wanted to talk about it. So I think that it's important that we continue talking about what we can do afterwards and really put our heads together, whether it's mobilizations in front of federal buildings or US consulates, it's petition campaigns. Let's use this time to connect more often like we're doing today.
I think we have a question from Chris Mann. Nathan, do you see that question?
Yes. Chris Mann asks, for Ellen and Don, why are the non-traditional therapies linked with the traditional methods of treatment?
I can start with a quick story on that, if that's okay. In my first visits to Cuba back in 1993 or so, when Cuba was in full out special period and the economy was so tanked, back then the consultorios, the family doctor's offices, externally they looked very similar to what Don showed you in his slides, but supplies were really short. In most offices there was just a stethoscope and maybe a baby scale, and even the paper to write the medical records was donated from the people on the block because paper was in such short supply. But I remember we went to one of those consultorios and we met the doctor, and she said, well, we don't have access to this or this or this or this medicine. But then she walked out with us and we followed her. We went into the backyard and she said, but we found out that the bark of this orange tree, if we boil it, it makes a really good cough syrup. And if we use acupuncture, we can do this, this, and this. And so at first it got described as something that was substituting for all the medicines they couldn't get. But then the Cubans, with their unique vision, they said, most of the people in the world can't afford that other stuff.
Right.
And so if we can develop these technologies, we can give, we can share that as a gift and educate people about how to work in low-tech environments to make people well.
Mm-hmm.
Don, you might want to say more?
Yes, I think that's really important. That for Cubans, there's not really a distinction between the traditional and non-traditional. It's called a natural medicine. And it's odd because in the United States, when people say traditional medicine, they often mean going to a doctor's office, and non-traditional something that is homeopathic or something like acupuncture. And when it's actually the reverse. In other words, the traditional methods are the ones that have been around for thousands of years. And a lot of what people do, and the Americans do now, is to use very updated medicines of a lot of medications that really have not been studied all that well. And like we just heard, a lot of things like boiling tree bark or taking herbs out of the ground, those are much less likely to have the negative effects of a lot of other medications. And so, a good treatment is always going to start with the least invasive therapy first, unless it's an emergency, and go from there to more invasive. And I mean, when I first started going to my doctor, the doctor always wanted to know if I could, wanted to take blood pressure medication, and always started with that as opposed to starting with exercise and diet. And so the exercise and diet is the more traditional approach to high blood pressure. And so a lot of these things work. And so a doctor who's really doing a good job will integrate things. A lot of times the traditional medicine is something which is more lifestyle. And there could be other things that are invasive, such as acupuncture, but a lot of times it's lifestyle. And this is really, I think, is much better medicine, to do the least invasive technique first and then go to the more invasive if the least invasive doesn't work.
Okay, we'll accept one more question and bring this meeting to a close. But Allison Boding, I saw some flash across the screen, an announcement. You want to make an announcement?
No, not this time. I typed something and it appears some Arabic happened in the type, but it's supposed to say May 19th. I don't know how that happened. I'm also going to post, just for everyone to know, we're in Canada and actually Kiev, Ukraine, we've been organizing protests on May 17th, or sorry, on the 17th of each month at US consulates. And since COVID-19, we've had one digital protest, and now we're going to do another for May 17th. So I'll put the link there too, and anyone from around the world can join. There'll be international speakers participating, and we're going to make signs and hold them up and share that around. So that's part of an ongoing campaign of coordinated actions on the 17th of every month that we do here with Friends of Cuba against the US blockade.
If I could jump in real quick and just say, I think that that's an example of the kind of creative, organizing that can be done and needs to be done, especially in this time. I think that that's not necessarily just something that can happen up in Vancouver or in Canada. We could take a page out of their book and be thinking about how to make use of this technology in a way that's going to allow us to continue to do this work. We've got the Cuba conference that had been planned, an in-person conference for November. I'm sorry, it was for March, and we rescheduled it for November. We don't know what's going to be happening in November, but we're beginning to have conversations about part of that conference being, in person if possible, and virtual if not. But I think we just all got to be thinking creatively and outside of the box in terms of how we continue to do the organizing that we do.
Okay, we have one last question, and I think that's from Octavia Pandela. I believe, Nathan.
Octavio Padilla. He says, hi everyone, Octavio here from Miami, where anti-Castro Cubans have been obsessed with getting rid of Castro. I want to thank you all for recognizing Cuba's medical achievements, and let's not forget Cuba has supported liberation movements in many countries, Angola, Grenada, Nicaragua, Zanzibar Revolution, Algeria, Yemen, Libya, Mozambique, to name a few. And this is the question: can the Green Party adopt a lift the embargo against Cuba in every state as a national platform? Maybe that for Howie to start.
Where's Howie?
That's a great question for Howie. Howie, are you still on?
I'm still on. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, that's a great idea. It's something that my campaign will promote. It's something the Green Party certainly can do. And I think in this COVID crisis, in comparing what we're doing, the total failure here, and what they're doing in Cuba, it's a good opportunity to link it to what's on everybody's mind, which is, you know, our friends and family are getting sick and some are dying. So I think that's a great idea, and I will talk it up.